The Scots Presbyterian Covenanters defeated the royalist forces of Charles I in the Bishop Wars of 1639 and 1640. It was the first of Rangers' 100,000 league titles, or however many they claim to be up to now. They had seen off Charles more easily than Neil Lennon. The whole thing was basically done after 10 days of fighting in October 1640, about the same length of time that the season's title race lasted. And so Charles, he needed to raise funds to pay off the Covenanters and to put down a rebellion in Ireland. Charles had been over in Ireland trying to civilise the Irish, because they're a very uncivilised people, the Irish, not like the Brits, Because when you think of Ireland, you always associate the British-controlled northern part of the island to be the most civilised, don't you, right? Charles, he was trying to impose Anglicanism on Ireland, the same that he had tried to do in Scotland, and they were having absolutely none of it. I don't know when Charles was just going to learn that nobody wanted his shitty Anglicanism. You can't honestly expect the people of Ireland to watch the Vicar of Dibley instead of Father Ted. I mean, come on. Seriously, mate? Fuck off. So Charles, he had to call a parliament to raise funds, but Charles didn't like calling parliaments. He had ruled in England for 11 years without once calling a meeting of the English Parliament. It was known as the 11-year tyranny, and it lasted from 2010 until 2021. Actually, do you know what? I think I'm getting that mixed up with the 11-year Tory tyranny. But the English parliamentarians, they wanted to make sure that Charles couldn't dissolve the parliament again. So what they did was they gathered all of their complaints against him and they presented them to the parliament in a grand remonstrance in November 1641. Charles had over 200 complaints against him, which was about the same as Alex Salmond. Although it really isn't that impressive. You think about that nowadays, my God, the Tories get through about 200 grievances in a day. And so Charles, he wasn't very good at accepting criticism. He was kind of like Piers Morgan in that respect. And so when the Parliament passed the Grand Remonstrance, he charged the parliamentary leaders with treason, and he descended upon the House of Commons with a force of 400 swordsmen, where he strode towards the Speaker of the House and he demanded that he point out who the leader of the Liberal Democrats was. There was roars of laughter in the chamber, and they were like that, mate. Nobody knows who the leader of the Liberal Democrats is. You kidding me? All of these parliamentary leaders that Charles had come to reprimand, they'd all been tipped off. None of them were there. Charles very famously said, "All my birds have flown," which is what Boris Johnson says when he ejaculates, or if you ever ask him about his children. And so Charles, he was heckled and he was laughed at by the Parliament. And the only way that he could control the English Parliament now was through military force. And so he raised his standard in Nottingham in August 1642, marking the beginnings of the English Civil War between the Royalists, i.e. those who supported King Charles I, and the parliamentarians, men such as Oliver Cromwell, for example. Now, in Scotland at that time, there was a split between those who had signed the National Covenant, between the extreme Presbyterians who felt that the covenant didn't go far enough. They wanted to create a theocracy, a godly state, whereby God told them what to do, so they didn't need a king. They would just press on and depose the king. Then there was the moderates who were happy to curtail some of the more arbitrary powers of the king, but they didn't want to depose him, and they really just wanted to play golf on a Sunday. And so there was a split between two camps. There was the Royalist movement, which was headed up by James Douglas, the Marquess of Montrose. Douglas was a charismatic, swashbuckling, brilliant military leader. And the Covenanters, who supported the English parliamentarians, they were headed up by Archibald Campbell, the Marquess of Argyll, a very kind of austere, quite dour, but a brilliant politician. And so basically in Scotland, you had a decision to make. Do you support the extreme Presbyterians, ultra-Presbyterianism, or do you support the monarchy? It was like Sophie's choice for Rangers fans. Now, the Covenanters, they had the best army across the three kingdoms. They may have been miserable, but they were also very successful as well. They were like Andy Murray. And so everyone wanted their army. And when they supported the English parliamentarians, they essentially won the war for them. But in exchange for their military support, the parliamentarians had to agree to the Solemn League and Covenant, which basically said that they would agree to install Presbyterianism in England and Ireland as well as Scotland. So what Charles I had done with Anglicanism to Scotland, which had led to the signing of the National Covenant, the Covenanters were now doing with Presbyterianism in England and in Ireland. And it was because of the differences that were starting to... Well, basically, the English parliamentarians, they were happy to accept the military part of the Solemn League, but they were never going to really follow through with all of the religious stuff. They were just using Scotland for their own gain, basically. And this was before we even had oil. And so there was differences between the parliamentarians and the Covenanters. And Charles, he was trying to exploit these differences when he surrendered not to the English parliamentarians and Oliver Cromwell, but to the Scots Covenanters. He was trying to exploit the differences between the two and hopefully get Covenanter support. But it didn't really work out that way. The Covenanters couldn't believe their luck. They had the king in their possession, but they didn't know what to do with him. They didn't want to take Charles back to Scotland because it might spark a resurgence in royalist support. And the English parliamentarians, they were apoplectic with rage at the fact that the Covenanters had the king in their possession in England. And so in the end, the Covenanters, they simply sold Charles. They sold him for £200,000. They sold out the monarchy for £200,000, a bit like Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, getting paid for an Oprah Winfrey interview. Now, as bad as Charles may have been, this was not well received in Scotland, because Charles may have been a bit of a dick, but he was still a Scottish king from a Scottish royal family. This was a very unpatriotic thing that the Covenanters had done. And when Oliver Cromwell executed Charles I on the 30th of January 1649, such was the strength of feeling in Scotland that we declared Charles's son, Prince Charles, to be Charles II in defiance of Oliver Cromwell. And it's the rule of Charles II and the exploits of the great Montrose, which I'm going to speak to you guys about next time. Thank you so much for listening.